Thank you. And we're thankful that Dr. Ward has agreed to speak for us. This is being put on through SOLAS, which is the Student Association for Latin American Studies. Evan R. Ward is a visiting fellow at the Wheatley Institution and an associate professor of history at Brigham Young University. Ward previously taught as an assistant and associate professor at the University of North Alabama, where he also served as the interim director of the Center for International Programs. His main research interests include economic history, Latin American history, natural resource policy, and tourism development. He has received an undergraduate degree from BYU and graduate degrees from the University of Georgia. Ward and his wife, Janine, are the parents of 2 children. And without any other introduction, I guess, we have Dr. Ward. Thank you so much.
The recently concluded Winter Games in Sochi, Russia, provided an upcoming World Cup throughout Brazil, followed by the 2016 Summer Games in Rio, will offer elite athletic competition for the world to enjoy. It is worth noting that the 2018 World Cup will also be held in Russia, and Olympic Stadium in Sochi will host preliminary games. Sochi provides an interesting case study of a neglected region being developed simultaneously for tourism and global games. Contrary to popular belief, however, Sochi's place on the Russian and Central Asian tourist map goes back much farther than the run-up to the recent games. In fact, in 1967, New York Times reporter Raymond H. Anderson discovered, quote, a tropical resort where large modern hotels of glass and concrete have already risen above the city's lush greenery and palms, Himalayan spruce, and cypress on slopes overlooking the Black Sea. Anderson's article is also interesting, not only because it enlarges our understanding of Sochi's role as a tourism destination nearly 50 years ago, but also creates a bridge in time to another place where mega events in tourism, mega projects aligned, in this case Mexico in 1968. The Olympics in Mexico City and the events leading up to it have largely shaped our perceptions of Mexico that year. We can even be more specific. First, student demonstrators at the Plaza of Three Cultures in northern Mexico City questioned government expenditures for the games. On the night of October 2nd, 1968, marksmen posted above the enclosed plaza opened fire on the crowd, killing an estimated 300 protesters. Second, the indelible image of Tommy Smith and John Carlos thrusting their sheathed fists into the night sky as a symbol of black power while standing on the metal podium during the games, visually reverberated throughout the world on television and in newspapers. As a result of those 2 iconic moments, historical discussions of the Mexico City Games have centered on questions of global human rights and a pivotal, though tragic, moment in the evolution of Mexican democracy. While I by no means want to detract from the centrality of those events, I would like to spend time this morning discussing how the actions of one man, and I use this picture because he's smiling, the thin, balding native from the state of Chihuahua, Antonio Ortiz Mena, helps expand our broader understanding of the Mexican government's strategies during that year to promote tourism development and heighten Mexico's exposure on the world stage. Ortiz served as the Secretary of the Treasury between 1958 and 1970. He was part of a small but powerful group of Mexican politicians from the north that played a critical role in positioning Mexico's economy towards greater integration with the United States. For the purpose of this presentation today, I will focus on Ortiz's promotion of tourism development, which included funding the Olympic Games and at the same time planning new tourism centers in Cancun and Ixtapa. Both of these initiatives would be of particular interest and importance in attracting visitors from the United States. And so if you have ever spent time in Los Cabos, Ixtapa, or Cancun, or dreamed of doing so, then this presentation has some relevance to your lived experience or your future honeymoon plans. Exploring Ortiz's initiatives also connects us to three larger themes in Latin American studies. First, Mexico is amongst the earliest emerging nations to host a mega event while simultaneously developing innovative mass tourism destinations. Second, the actions of this one individual, Antonio Ortiz Mena, also played a significant role in shaping these plans. Finally, the hoisting of the Olympic rings and planning for ocean dreams in Mexico during the late 1960s helps us better understand the risks and rewards of hosting the upcoming World Cup and Olympic Games in Brazil. So let's begin by going back to Mexico City in 1968. It's somewhat of a different city than it is there today, although I will tell you that if you're going to visit one city in Mexico, that's the one to visit. It's culturally just a wonderful place. The modern, bustling metropolis, noted for its wide boulevards, temperate weather, and manicured parks, held out promise as one of the great new tourist destinations in the world at the time. Mexico's economy enjoyed a period of sustained growth beginning in the 1940s, an era known as the Mexican Miracle. Industry grew at a fast pace during this period. A discernible middle class emerged as well. And finally, the Mexican government charted a more independent foreign policy than it had prior to this time, embracing relations with Cuba instead of following the lead of the United States in breaking off ties with the Caribbean island following Fidel Castro's successful coup in 1959. These developments suggested that Mexico was on the cusp of joining the club of modern nations. And yet, the two iconic images of Mexico City in 1968 that persist in our minds, a blood-stained public plaza and two defiant black fists, overshadow those economic aspirations. Developing a deeper understanding of the significance of 1968 for Mexico's history, looking forward instead of looking back, invites us to conjure additional symbols to represent that pivotal year. As such, I'd like to propose that we add a Volkswagen Beetle, 100,000 of which had been produced in Puebla, Mexico by 1968, and a bathing suit. This was one of the more appropriate images from Cancun to use. And I use these two as symbols of Antonio Ortiz Mena's critical contributions to Mexican tourism during its coming out party in 1968. I'd like to associate these two symbols with Ortiz's specific contributions to Mexican tourism at the time, as well as to his legacy, which I think most American tourists that go to a beach resort in Mexico today are part of, even if they may not realize it. However, before we do this, we should see how these measures fit into his overall philosophy for promoting economic development in Mexico. From a historical perspective, Ortiz is best remembered for stabilizing the Mexican economy by three ways. One, encouraging the production and consumption of Mexican products. So producing goods in Mexico that would be consumed by Mexicans instead of relying completely on imports. Second, increasing government revenues through tax reforms. In 1961, he was instrumental in completely revamping the tax system, and I'll talk about that in a minute, as well as harnessing international investment to stimulate economic development throughout the country. This was really interesting to me because I had always thought that Mexico borrowed money to develop Cancun because they needed the financial assistance. But Antonio Ortiz Mena talks in his memoirs about his philosophy, it was cheaper to borrow the money, and he'd figured this out, to borrow the money and pay it back than it was to use the state coffers to do this. I don't understand how that works. I made a B- in economics at BYU. That was my lowest grade, so I won't attempt to explain it to you, but I believe him. He was a wizard. As noted above, Ortiz Mena served 2 6-year terms as Secretary of the Treasury. He served the first term under President Adolfo López Mateos from 1958 to 1964. In his memoirs, Ortiz narrates a meeting that he had with the new president. Quote, "The president mentioned to me that he was well aware of the importance of remaining within certain guidelines of the use of federal revenues." So this is the preface to what he's about to tell his Minister of Secretary of the Treasury. "Nevertheless, he told me that he had bad news." Ortiz then recounts, quote, "He pulled from one of the drawers in his desk some papers that described the project of building the National Museum of Anthropology and some other initiatives in Mexico City." And I've added in parentheses here, this presumably was one of these was the bid for the Olympic Games. He commented to me that he considered these projects to be of great importance, even when it would require the use of significant tax revenue. Ortiz recognized the economic and symbolic importance of these initiatives and encouraged their development. Furthermore, all of these components, I'm going to list 3 here, the Anthropological Museum, and I hope you've been there if you've been to Mexico City, 2, the Summer Games of 1968, and 3, these new tourism centers were part of a coherent puzzle meant to boost foreign revenues and enhance Mexico's global image. First, the world-famous Anthropological Museum would showcase the country's pre-Columbian patrimony. Commercialized motifs of pre-Hispanic icons also accented the designs for the games themselves. It's interesting to note that the architect for the new museum, Pedro Ramirez Vasquez, would also coordinate the cultural celebrations associated with the 1968 Summer Games. Second, at the same time, the museum and the Summer Games launched a new era in Mexican tourism. Finally, that same year, the federal government pursued loans from the Inter-American Development Bank and the World Bank to create a uniquely Mexican genre of tourism projects known as integrally planned tourism centers, or CIPs. First ones at Cancun and Ixtapa. Ortiz's responsibility in relation to the Olympics specifically was to increase government revenues in order to offset foreign expenditures. I mentioned that the automobile was one of the symbols of Ortiz Mena's tenure in office. Now, this didn't just refer to any automobile, but instead to cars driven in Mexico that were 10 years old or less, including new cars. At the end of 1962, the Mexican Congress passed a law imposing a progressive tax on newer automobiles that would increase every year for 10 years. Coincidentally, and I think this is a coincidence, this was the first year that Volkswagen started building Beetles in Puebla, Mexico. Although there's some debate over the purpose of the tax, also known as the tenencia, most journalists and historians agree that the purpose of the tax was to fund the 1968 Summer Olympics. Some doubt has been cast on this fact because it was passed prior to the International Olympic Committee awarding the Games to Mexico City. However, most sources identify the tenencia as the source of funding once the Games had been awarded in 1963. Now, this isn't out of the realm of the possible. If you're from Arizona, they passed a tax to build the indoor baseball diamond there before Arizona had actually received the announcement that the Diamondbacks would play there. So this isn't just sort of the sleight of hand of an authoritarian government. It's also planning. They're planning for this to happen. Ortiz's contributions to Mexican tourism development also took more direct forms than taxpayer support for the Olympics. Until the 1960s, Acapulco was the crown jewel of Mexican resort destinations. It is safe to say, however, that the luster of that jewel had begun to fade. Historian Andrew Sackett has written about the declining image and rising costs of working there. Here's an image just from last year. Maybe it can help you imagine what was starting to happen in the late 1960s. Here's a quote. During the winter months, Acapulco often accommodated 60,000 tourists at a time. Now, put this into context. I think Cancun has well over 1 million tourists coming a year. If you multiply 60,000 by 12, I mean, you're only getting 720,000. So places like Cancun have eclipsed, well eclipsed. I may be mistaken, but I think the number is actually closer to 2 million a year. When Cancun's developed, the Mexican government agency is comparing that one city, that one tourism destination with Jamaica, with the Bahamas, one city compared to a whole country of tourism. So this was going to be tourism on a scale unprecedented in the Caribbean. We continue about the problems with Acapulco. By the 1960s, tourists could no longer live on $5 a day, but numerous Mexican families survived on less. Indeed, waiters often supported families of 4 or more on $3 a day or less. With this, they paid some of the highest rents in the country. You know, go get a service industry job in Park City, and you'll find out that most of those people that work at Quiznos actually live in Salt Lake, and they take a bus up to Park City because what you make working in Acapulco, what you make working in Park City, does not pay for you to actually live there. With this, they paid some of the highest rents in the country, living in tenements unfit for human habitations, tiny rooms where 10, 12 people lived, sharing sanitary facilities with many neighbors. The city was also faced with a growing pollution problem. For many, obviously it hasn't been resolved. For many of the houses were not connected to the rudimentary sewer networks. Thus, human waste mixed with household garbage and dead animals in the streets, and open drainage canals that ran down through the city to the bay. Close quote. As a measure of reform, the Lopez Mateos administration, with the blessing of Ortiz, proposed a new type of tourist destination, the integrally planned tourism centers, or CIPs. These innovative tourist communities were intended as a reform. I think this is really important to point out. Looking forward, this was a solution. The problem with a lot of the way that Cancun is seen today is that it's a problem. I'd like to suggest the idea that once you put ideas into motion, they often take on a life of their own for very logical reasons, but ones that were completely unintended by those that designed them. These new centers would be geographically segregated from the communities where hotel and construction workers lived. The land for these communities would largely be acquired by the national government through direct purchase from title-owning landholders. Ironically, and this is kind of what's funny, this made it easier than it had been in Acapulco for the government to directly sell real estate to investors. If you separate these cities away from the existing urban landscapes, and if this land has already been purchased outright, then Hyatt Regency, Hilton, Fiesta Americana, they can all either temporarily control this area or own it in the case of Mexican companies. The Mexican government had also spent some time and money scientifically studying the preference of its target clientele. There's actually a 300-page report that tells about this road trip that officials from the Banco de Mexico took to Miami, to Jamaica, to the Bahamas, to figure out what it was that American tourists like to do. Thus, amenities and attractions including hotels with massive swimming pools, golf courses, native-themed shopping centers, and of course, international airports that made access to these out-of-the-way resort cities convenient. That was actually the biggest problem with developing Cancun. It wasn't building the hotels. It was finally getting the breakthrough that you could have nonstop flights from the United States that didn't have to go through Mexico City. In geography, they call this friction of distance. And people generally will go places where they have to make fewer connections. Yet, like the 1968 games themselves, the carefully designed CIPs took on a life of their own. And let me show you a couple of images of Cancun. This is Cancun in the early 70s when the Camino Real Hotel is being built. It was the first hotel built there. They actually had fairly strict zoning laws in Cancun. This was going to be an environmentally safe and structured resort where you didn't have massive hotels that blocked people's views of the beach. I got this picture when I was down at Fonatur. That's the government. They actually have a government agency like the Social Security Service in the United States or the State Department. There's a government tourism agency that basically controls the real estate, hotel development at these CIPs. This is the first point in Cancun. You'll notice the Camino Real, and it's fairly low in terms of its height. Let's fast forward 36 years to that same spot. That's the same. Here's the Camino Real. They've actually added a tower to it, and I'll finish up with this, giving some statistics before we turn to talk about Brazil for a minute. Like the 1968 games themselves, the carefully designed CIPs took on a life of their own. Due to a decline in the value of the peso in the early 1980s, Cancun hotel developers reacted to the drop in room rates because your dollar could buy so much more by building more hotel rooms in taller buildings that actually violated the early zoning codes laid out by government planners. By 2011, Cancun, and I'm talking just about this island here, boasted approximately 30,000 hotel rooms. And that's 13,000 more. Actually, it's about, it is 13,000 more than the Salt Lake metropolitan area alone. So I'm talking about basically the entire Wasatch Front from the point of the mountain, let's say up through before Ogden. If the Riviera Maya, or beachfront property from Cancun down to the border between Mexico and Belize, is included, the greater Cancun metropolitan area boasts 65,000 hotel rooms. The Riviera Maya has actually overtaken Cancun now in the number of rooms. Who's the major investor now in these by nationality? The Spanish. You're more likely to stay at a Iberostar or a Melia hotel than you are to stay at a Hilton or a Hyatt Regency. On the other hand, Ixtapa, located approximately 75 miles north of Acapulco, never reached the economic expectations of Fonatur, largely because the ocean current is much stronger there, and so kind of playing and frolicking in the water on the beach can actually be a little more dangerous there than on the Caribbean. Antonio Ortiz Mena left the Secretary of the Treasury with the election of Luis Echeverria in 1970. However, Ortiz never seems to have given up on the promise of tourism in Mexico. He would go on to be appointed to 3 5-year terms as the director of the Inter-American Development Bank in Washington, D.C. And in that role, he promoted development throughout Latin America. While he made few overt references to his work on behalf of Mexican tourism, he did in at least one of his official speeches for the Development Bank refer to one of the new CIPs with some pride, observing that, quote, "The tourism sector has become a significant factor in our activity. In connection with this, the bank is participating for the first time in a project located on Cancun Island, Mexico, involving tourism development of a hitherto economically undeveloped region." The prolific historian of Mexican and Latin American politics, who I would recommend that you read, there's a book called, I've assigned it to my History of Mexico class, Biography of Power. It's the best history, in my estimation, of Mexico. It looks biographically from about 1800 down to the present. The writing is exquisite. The storytelling is excellent. But the author of this book, Enrique Krause, considers Ortiz to be one of the most gifted Mexican statesmen never to have served as president of his country. He was, to some degree, the architect of Mexican economic growth during the 1960s, after which the economy began to decelerate. We're talking, my friends, about 6 to 7% growth from the mid-40s into the 60s. That's on par, if you think about China during a slow to average year. The Mexican economy was really growing at this time. While he's often recognized in this vein, I'm intrigued by the institutional role that he played in promoting extensive government expenditures on behalf of tourism development in the Olympics. Now, I want to make a bridge maybe to some questions by addressing what behind the scenes in Mexico in '68 suggests about Brazil in 2014. As a rule, historians, we squirm a little bit when we're asked to predict the future based on our work. If what is said about the past is true, that it's a foreign country, then we might also say that a study of the past does not give us a passport to the future. Studying history may help, however, in understanding differences in similar events over time and space. Given the upcoming mega events in Brazil, I'd like to finish with a few observations about the relationship between Mexico in '68 and the World Cup in Brazil later this year. First, Mexico's total experience in 1968, including the student protests, the summer games, and increased promotion of tourism, suggests that no amount of planning will ever mask political and social unrest in real time. So these two types of time, there's real time and then there's ritual time. The Olympics run on ritual time. It's programmed, it's a pageant, and things are supposed to go according to a schedule. Real time is what's happening contemporaneously with those events. I'd like to say that one of the reasons why Beijing, in my estimation, was fairly successful is that the country was on an arc, an economic arc towards Beijing becoming one of the major world cities, and so they benefited from that. It wasn't just that you had acrobats that were practicing 14 hours a day for the opening ceremony. It's what was going on in the economic, political context of geopolitics that sort of came together at that moment. The democratic pains of a rising generation directly challenged the authoritarian state at the Plaza of Three Cultures. If the protests and subsequent massacre of students cast a shadow over the games themselves, then the Black Power protests 2 weeks later during the Olympics injected global human rights controversies directly into the ritual fabric of the event. An infinite number of scripted dress rehearsals could not have anticipated such extraordinary incidents. This was not only evident in Mexico in 1968, but more recently in Russia and neighboring Ukraine during the recent Winter Games. During the closing ceremonies, Tchaikovsky's first piano concerto played in Fish Stadium while Kiev burned. And it's interesting, Tchaikovsky actually got the beginning bars from that piece of music from street musicians when he was in Kiev in 1875. There's a certain irony there. The world's attention had already shifted 600 miles to the north and within days to the Crimean crisis. We need to emphasize that Brazilian democracy is much stronger than that of its BRIC counterpart on the Black Sea. However, it is also quite possible that the protests sparked last June in Brazil in response to inflation and profligate government expenditures on the World Cup and the Olympics. And here's another factor that I think could play a role, particularly with the Olympics in 2016. Right now, we're seeing a deterioration in support for left-center and populist governments in Latin America. And the three places where that poses the biggest challenge to stability is Argentina, Venezuela, and Brazil. I do not say this to call Brazil's ability to host the games into question. I've written elsewhere that actually protests are a sign of democratic society, but they complicate people's views of what means a country is fit to host the games. I do not say this to call Brazil's ability to host the games into question, but instead to recognize that the priorities of democracy and development often conflict. Brazil at present is one of the most democratic countries to receive multiple opportunities to host mega events in such a short period of time. Slowing economic growth and continued discontent amongst Brazil's electorate may simply point to changes at the ballot box. And yet, if these frustrations boil over into the streets, the glare of the world's gaze during the next 2 years, as in Mexico during 1968, could tarnish the global image of these events and Brazil in turn, whether this is justified or not. And I don't think judging the world you live in by sound bites and one-minute analyses of what's happening in the world is really the best way to analyze the world. Whether or not this is justified is a question separate from the lessons that Mexico City in 1968 teaches. Quite simply that the best laid plans, once set in motion, often take on a life of their own. Thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions or comments that anyone would like to make. This is actually a picture I took in Salvador de Bahia this last summer. I left the country a day before the protests started, and there was no real indication that this was going to happen. But this sign says a lot. It's using shorthand. It basically says, "Who is the World Cup for?" and has these symbols of justice in tagged graffiti. It's a really interesting question that's playing itself out. Any questions or comments?
I've got a question for you, Dr. Ward. So just kind of going back to Mexico and tourism development, we've seen a lot of development with tourism throughout a lot of countries in Latin America. And this is kind of a broad, vast question, but I'd just like to know your opinion. To what extent is tourism development throughout all of Latin America kind of like an economic safe hold for a lot of these countries, maybe Paraguay and some of these other countries that aren't as developed and kind of struggling economically right now?
Thank you. That's a great question. In the literature, tourism is actually viewed as an export. It's treated as an export because largely you don't send your product somewhere else, but the customers come to you. The idea behind tourism development in Latin America was that it would create new jobs. And I've tried to make a distinction about what economic growth is. It's where you basically have more of the same. Service industry jobs, jobs in hospitality, versus the growing sophistication of an economy, which I call development. I used this example yesterday in one of my classes. Building the Adobe complex up near the point of the mountain, that's development. Building a Hampton Inn or another burrito shop in Provo is growth. And so what's happened, tourism development has swelled economic growth, but it's had a tougher time making Latin American economies more sophisticated. And so it hasn't necessarily had the overall impact that people thought that it would. Now, Cancun's an interesting case. They had a hurricane in 2006. The idea there was Cancun went from a city of like 100 people, it wasn't even a city, in 1967 to today has a metropolitan area of over 750,000 people. It in itself has become a megacity. The idea is that soon Cancun can be a financial center like Miami. It already has the second biggest airport in Mexico. Cancun does, after Mexico City. And so, we don't really know this arc completely, but what's interesting is the World Bank's pulled out of financing tourism because the return on true development just isn't what had been hoped for. I actually got all of these ideas about writing about the Olympics the first week of January. I was sitting in the World Bank doing research on Ixtapa, which hasn't been written about a lot. It's actually a very glorious place to go because there aren't as many tourists there. But it's in Guerrero. It's about 70 miles north of Acapulco. And it hit me while I was sitting there that the trend we've now seen is for cities in Latin America to host mega events rather than to be saddled with a bunch of hotels maybe that aren't filling up. And so Buenos Aires in 1996 threw their hat in the ring for the 2004 Olympics. They didn't get it, but they had the plans for it to go forward. Brazil, obviously, they're going to build some hotels, some stadiums, but the gaze of the world is largely going to be there for a short amount of time, and then it will leave. For tourists, this is actually preferable. To be able to say that you've been somewhere for an event, now for a tourist is much more desirable than saying I spent a week on the beach somewhere. Because going to Cancun is no longer exclusive. Just tell me when you go down there if the plane's empty. I mean, it will probably even be full despite the travel warnings. But being able to say you were somewhere for an event is now what sort of jet-setting tourists want to be able to say they've done. So that was kind of a long answer to your question, but yeah. Any other questions or comments?
I know you touched on it just a little bit, Dr. Ward, but my question is, what have been the trends recently in Cancun and in forecasting the future? What does the future hold for Cancun and the Maya Riviera?
Hotel growth has slowed there a little bit. One of the interesting facts about Cancun is that they calculated the number of schools and hospitals based on the number of hotel rooms there rather than the number of people that actually lived there. I mean, that's quite a formula. You're working out what types of social services you're going to provide. From 2006 to the present, they haven't added many hotel rooms there, and I would argue that now the most attractive reason for going to Cancun is to catch a taxi somewhere else, either to Belize or to go and find an ecotourism spot where you feel like you're enriching the environment, but you're actually setting down your footprint, which is, there's an irony in that. But it will probably continue on as a low-cost tourism destination that will feed the Mayan Riviera, which I think in and of itself is going to be saturated over time. Beyond that, I really don't have any predictions. But it's a good question. I'd love to see it. I mean, you think about what happens to strip malls in the United States. In fact, there's a Kneaders in American Fork where they abandoned the original Kneaders and just built another new Kneaders on State Street. I love driving past that because I'm like, what, do these shells of buildings not have any other purpose? If Cancun can take on more sophisticated roles in the regional economy, that would be the best thing that could happen, to become a center of finance. There's a university there now. And so targeting maybe development as a community rather than a tourist destination might be the best way to not leave that megacity, which began as a skiff on the ocean, to just deteriorate like other places, like Acapulco. Any other questions?
Thanks for this, and I don't even know if you're going to be able to address this at all, but I was wondering, have you noticed, I mean, you said you just sort of began following some of this relatively recently. Has there been any take-up from the protesters who are voicing their concerns in Brazil? Has there been any hearkening back to or solidarity across time with the same kinds of protests that were made in Mexico City? Do they see at all any kind of kinship between those things, and that profligate spending, as you put it, in Latin America in general on projects largely for foreigners, or at least partly for foreigners, that there's some kind of kinship there? Do they take up similar slogans? Do they have do they use similar arguments? Have you come across anything like that?
No, I actually have not looked into that. Let me just put a fly in the ointment here. My views on the Olympics and the mega events are changing. We hear that the Sochi Games cost $50 billion. I've made the argument elsewhere that countries don't spend money in logical fashion. It's not like you could take that $50 billion and then that if you didn't spend it on the Olympics, that it would be spent on programs for what we would call the basic basket of goods, on food, subsidies, and that sort of thing. I've been trying to put my finger on U.S. spending. In 2010, I think we spent $700 billion on military expenses. Russia last year spent $58 billion on the military, and they spent $50 billion on the Olympics. Now, if you actually calculated part of that $50 billion as, I guess, bad for an exposure this year, what country doesn't spend money on projects meant to preen its image? The irony about local protest associated with Olympic Games is that the way that you get the games is by local support. And by and large, there are a lot more supporters of these events than there are people protesting. Now, I think what's important to get in that in-between space is if those voices are squelched exclusively, and if this is targeted by the government to put down voices of protest. Buenos Aires, when they had their bid for the 2004 games, said there are no objectors to this, and I don't believe that. So I'm looking in newspapers to find that. But that's actually something I'd be interested in looking at, if there is solidarity across time and space about this. Any other questions?
Do I need to stand up?
Yes, it's obligatory.
I just don't want to.
It shows your submission.
So you've been talking about economic growth and how these events have brought economic growth for these countries, nations. My question is, what can be done so these events can also bring development? Because you talk about this difference. Are these regulations that need to be imposed by the Olympic Committee or the FIFA or by the government that is hosting the games?
I don't think they can bring about development.
No?
In fact, in a piece I wrote for the Deseret News on February 23rd, you know, the best thing that could come out of the World Cup and the Olympics, because Brazil has such a shortage of hotel rooms, is that the organizing committees would actually encourage services like Airbnb to have people take in visitors for the games. You know where they actually started that? This idea of families hosting people during the Olympics? It was in Mexico City in 1968. Maybe this was done before that. Mexico City had a shortage of hotel rooms. I think the most we can hope for is that the growth that actually occurs trickles down into more pockets. And so, you know, I make a plug for Airbnb. Turn your extra room into a hotel room and make money. What the tickets for Brazil already for Rio, $2,500, $1,000 above what you would normally pay. Hotel rooms, you're going to pay $500 to $750 a night. So it's a question of supply and demand. Let's put some more of the supply of people into the hands of individuals. Ken, we'll let you have the last word.
You talked a little bit about this, about how the beaches in Cancun, I guess, were better than on the Pacific side. I was wondering if there's any other reasons why maybe Cancun and that area has developed more for tourism and not so much other Mayan regions, maybe Guatemala or Chiapas or even like Oaxaca?
I would say accessibility. When Fonatur put forward their presentation on why Cancun or any of these cities, but particularly Los Cabos, it's because of the distance by airplane. I think there are 76 destinations that you can reach from Cancun directly. And so that ease of contact, particularly with people that would be going to other Caribbean destinations, has made a big difference. That's also why I think Los Cabos, for Californian residents, is a bigger draw. And finally, they planned. If you've ever seen the movie Field of Dreams, they built this baseball park out in the middle of Iowa. When they put down the tarmac in Cancun, they put down a tarmac that could receive 747s right from the beginning. In contrast, in Guatemala, around Tikal, they just updated that airport about 20 or 30 years ago to receive 727s, 737s. And so a lot of it has to do with planning, but you better be prepared for what will come if you make those types of plans. Thank you for coming.